All right, welcome everybody. Sorry for our delay with technical issues, but we're starting at 2:04, which isn't too bad. My name is Warren Epstein. I'm the communications director here at Pikes Peak Community College. And assisting us here, we have Karen, who will be monitoring your comments on Facebook. We have Haley, who will be interpreting for you. And our main guest is our new Chief Diversity Officer at Pikes Peak Community College, Tiko Hardy. Tiko, welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
And Tiko is certainly not new to the college and won't be new to a lot of you folks out there. But Tiko, before you start with your presentation, let's tell a little bit about yourself and how you landed in that desk.
Fantastic. Well, I think for me, when I start looking at how I got here, how I landed, I can't really tell that story without telling my story of growing up in generational poverty. And basically going from a foster care home to foster care home, ultimately resulting in me dropping out of school in the 9th grade and later getting my GED. And I think what's really profound about that is that here came an ideal that I could go. Somebody told me to go to community college. And just by going to community college, it really changed the trajectory of my future. And as far as this particular job, I think there came a time that most of us had when there was a lot of racial tension, social unrest. And for me, it became about, I looked at the murders of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Aubrey Ahmaud, and I thought to myself, how can I do more? And so when this opportunity kind of met the timing and they both came together, and I felt this would be an opportunity for me to try to do more. And so that's how I got here.
And before this, talk about your role at the college before this one.
So before this, I came to the college in 2015, started out in teaching social work and psychology initially. And then as our caseload grew and our enrollment grew, ended up teaching full-time in social work. Prior to that, came out of retail management and doing a lot of things in social work, from child welfare, child protective services, medical social work, etc.
And Dr. Hardy, I'd love you to show your PowerPoint, because it's a presentation really about how your vision is going to help reshape our college.
Absolutely. So I'll share this with you all. First of all, Warren, you have my permission just to call me Tiko, and I'm totally okay with that. And what I wanted to share with the audience is a little bit of what I shared with the executive team. How do we go from here, and how can we basically build on the foundations of what we already have done in equity work to where we want to go now? Okay. All right, let me see here. Might want me to. It's frozen up on me. Give me 1 second.
Try the space bar. Not moving?
No. I'm going to come out of this and go back in.
Carl. Well, while we're waiting for to get that to be shareable and movable.
What about now? Can you see it?
I see it, but I don't see it changing to the second slide, if that's where you're going.
How about now?
You're sounding like my optometrist.
You should be able to see it. Can you see it now? And we're on the general definition slide.
Oh, let's see. Karen, are you seeing that? No, I'm not seeing it at all right now.
All right, let's try this again. You know how it is if you leave something sitting idle, sometimes it'll freeze. How about now?
No, but let's go ahead and move on, and we can come back to.
So let me tell you, I can give just a quick overview, and I think a big part of it for what the vision was when sharing with the executive leadership team was to talk about how can we all speak from a common language. So when we start looking at diversity, right, this is the ideal. Here are all of these individual characteristics of people, right? And I'm Black, I'm heterosexual, all of these kind of definitions. And then talking about ethnicity, the social, characteristics that we share. But I think the big thing that I wanted to really hit home with the leadership team is this idea of equity. as we're a higher education institution, it's really important that we really offer an opportunity for equitable education. And I was telling the leadership team that will never change. That's kind of the heartbeat of community college. And then as we begin to build equity, how do we also make sure that there's a sense of belonging at the same time as well? And so that was kind of where I was coming from with the leadership team and really making that distinction between equality, equity, and then social justice.
And I'm trying to share my screens now. Can you see that?
I can, yes. It has the definitions.
Yeah. Ready to move on?
Yes. So here's what I really briefly, there's only about 5 slides in this, or 6 or 7 slides in this presentation, but I wanted to update you on the staff changes and the revision to job descriptions. Basically, at the moment, it's just myself, and we are going to be looking to hire somebody full-time eventually once we're ready for that. So we will grow from me, hopefully, to 1 or 2 other people. Who are our stakeholders? Well, really, it's everybody. It's faculty, it's staff, it's students, college leadership, and the executive leadership team. And as we grow, this idea of the community piece is also our stakeholders as well. So here's what we really spent a lot of time on in the executive leadership team meeting was we were talking about equity, social justice, advancing human rights, and all of those things have to take place in order to provide an organizational cultural shift. If you've been at the college anytime, when we started the mobile food pantry, it was this perspective out there that if students were going to college, then they weren't necessarily hungry or dealing with food insecurity. So once we launched this program, we began to shift the culture of our organization. We began to shift to thinking about, wait a minute, just because our students are here, it doesn't mean that they're all doing well as it pertains to food insecurity. And that's kind of the same thing that we're going to have to do when we look at equity. So the reality is that there's always different barriers for many people across the board. And then this equality is maybe if we can get everybody on the same level, then that would also be equitable. But then what we thought about is that not everybody needs the same thing. And there's not a one size fits all. And so when we start to think about equity, it's essentially what every student, staff, faculty, instructor needs to make sure that they can be successful. And then the social justice piece would combine all of them, saying that we're going to move any barrier for anybody. And then therefore we can operate from that premise. And so that's where we're going to spend a lot of our time, equity, inclusion, and then that social justice piece.
I like that, the idea that there's no fence at all and they can just watch the game.
Right, and so we remove the barriers, which is really what we want to do as a college. So I had a couple requests to talk about the name change. So we changed the name from the Center of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion to the Office of Equity and Inclusion. So there's a couple reasons why. When you start to think about DEI, it is generally at four-year institutions, this place where students can come hang out and kind of relax and kick their feet up, and it's this safe space. And we don't quite have that area quite yet. And so what our ideal was is how can we, regardless of what is going on in society, what are the things that can help us make sure that we're true to our mission and our vision? And that is the ideal of equitable education, and then the inclusion piece that we want to make sure that everybody shares a sense of belonging for the organization. So we're focusing on equity and inclusion. We're not getting rid of diversity. We just believe that if we focus on equity and inclusion, that diversity should be the outcome. We should really see that manifesting per se. And another thing that's super important that when we start thinking about that focus is really how we're shifting kind of from this knowledge base, raising a sense of awareness to how do we now have influence across the organization to lead change as far as it pertains to equity work. And the goal is to be intentional. is to make sure that everybody in this organization, in our organization, takes ownership to how we want to make sure that whether students, staff, faculty, and instructors, the environment that we want to create for us to work here, and also the learning environment that we want for our students. So it's not equity mindset, belongs to one group of people.
And one thing I love that you've said about this is that people have come to you and said, basically, so what are you going to do for me now with this whole equity and inclusion work? And you've pushed it right back on them saying,
right.
How are you going to be a partner in this?
How are you going to be a partner? How would you want to shape this organization? And how can we as an executive team empower you to do so? And I think it's all of our responsibilities to create the work environment and the learning environment that we want to have. So,
yeah, and I think that when you talk about inclusion, who does that include? Is that me?
Well, I think it's everybody, right? Sometimes we think there has to be a disparity, right? For you to be a part of a group. And really it doesn't. We really need everybody from every background with every experience to come to the table to have this conversation. You don't have to be have lived in poverty, but you also might be somebody that's been affluent. All we really want to know and what we want to do is how do we work together to make sure that this organization is representative of all of us. So that's everybody, regardless of political, religious affiliation, because we will have a more equitable organization when we all come to the table. And I think that's super important.
Well said.
So another reason that we wanted to look at the name change and just the offices, we wanted to make things simple. We wanted to figure out how we identify, document, and measure the impact of this office. And so we want to create a mechanism where we can say, what does our college need? Are we seeing requests for curriculum? Are we seeing requests to team cohesion? We want you to come talk to our team, or staff and leadership development. By doing this, and you'll see a form that'll come out later in a couple of weeks, we feel like we can gauge where we need to make sure that we have our resources allocated to. And then we want to use those to make sure that you, all of our stakeholders, are really having an opportunity to get what you need from the Office of Equity and Inclusion. And then lastly, just really want to provide clarity of focus and an understanding of what we do in the office per se. So here's this, and then we'll open it up shortly for questions, is that it is about all of us advancing equity and inclusion. And this is a continual commitment. And it takes for us all to be intentional. There's no one thing that I'm gonna do. There was no one thing that my predecessor could do, or anybody that's doing this work. It is all of us together being intentional. And then we are constantly creating a commitment, and I guess stating our commitment to equity work. And then all of us really, but this office specifically, we're here to advance the mission of the college. How do we help students succeed? And then how do we help staff, faculty, instructors, everybody be successful as well? And so I will stop it there. And then I think that is kind of that framework that I provided to the executive leadership team.
Yeah, one of the things that I think really built your own credibility in this area already was the work that you've done with the Equity Project. Can you tell people about that?
So the Equity Project is really focused on instructional services and how faculty can create a more equitable and inclusive learning environment in the classroom. And so we pretty much journey through that process through what we call critical inquiry, where we're looking, especially through a race-conscious lens, and we're looking at our classrooms, at our syllabus, at our assignments to analyze to see if they are equitable, see if are we actually entering into a partnership with our students. And so we use this idea of looking at what we do, looking for any patterns that we might see as it pertains to race, and then other patterns. And then we're reflecting on what we saw, and then trying to implement interventions to make a change. And so it's really, we just continue going on in that, using activities, observations, peer learning, and things to that nature. And we're finding great success.
Yeah, I was really blown away by that presentation that you and Karen Summerson gave about it. And the instructors that came up, you know, when they start talking about the level of in the weeds that it takes, because you could talk about big, broad concepts of equity, but when you start looking at, wow, we've had these group of students seem to drop off right at this assignment. What is there about this assignment that seems to be causing this effect? I mean, that to me is where the sweet spot is. That's where the change can really happen to me, don't you think?
Absolutely. And I think the biggest thing, at least that I took away from it when I was a participant in the equity project, is that it shifts the responsibility from what is PPCC going to do? What is the leadership team going to do? All of those are super important. But what it does is it makes me look at what am I going to do in my classroom to ensure the success of my students. And there's something about that personal responsibility piece that we get to own. And I felt like that was super empowering, because now I didn't have to worry about people outside of my class. Now I begin to take ownership in what I was doing. And we're not talking about things that's not in my control. So everything that I took responsibility for were things that was in my control.
Well, speaking of that, I mean, this was an amazing pilot project, and it obviously is going to continue, but how do we scale it up? I mean, how do we get all the faculty on board with taking that kind of lens to success in their classroom?
Well, I think there's a couple things. First, I think the majority of our faculty are on board. Now, I think what shifts is what are the different opportunities that we can offer for them to engage. So whether that's TEP, whether that's AQ, whether that's Achieving the Dream, all of these programs that are out there to try to close equity gaps. And so I think one of the things that Dr. Bolton has been super supportive of is how can we get as much or as many resources as possible available to our faculty to be able to impact the classroom. And so I think we scale it by, number one, having a variety of programs, but number two, also looking at, not everybody is going to go through 16 weeks in the equity project, but how do we make workshops? How do we make, PD Fridays where you only have to spend maybe 4 or 6 hours? And so those are things we're going to be looking at. How do we take the best practices from the equity project and create something for staff, and create something for, faculty and instructors and people who don't have the opportunity to spend 16 weeks going through a program.
And what do you say to instructors who say, it sounds like a great idea and I'm all for equity, but I don't want to lower the standards in my classroom?
And so, you know what, it's never about lowering the standards, right? It's about, we signed up to do a job that said we wanted to make sure that there was accessible, equitable education opportunities for everyone, not just for somebody that would go to Harvard or somebody that would go to all of these other schools. And when we signed up for that, we basically signed up to do whatever we needed to do to make sure that our students can be successful when they come to our school. So it's never, as a matter of fact, we actually raised the bar.
Right, for every student.
Yes.
Every student, it's interesting. I found that fascinating that the instructors were saying that, yeah, they may have been for one assignment looking at this through a racial or ethnic lens or whatever, but the outcomes affected everybody positively.
And it's the small things, right? It doesn't cost me anything to ask my students, how did your day go? How did things go when your kid was doing, at their recital? Oh, those are things that are free. It's just that showing a genuine concern that doesn't cost us anything. It actually is holding students to a higher expectation. And I always tell students that I won't lower the bar is here, but I will do everything in my power to help you get to the higher bar and the higher standard. And so those are some of the things that I think can be misleading, that we're changing the game, but really we're not. So one example, we do a syllabus exercise when you look at your syllabus and you're kind of coding it to see, is there a directive? Is there a rule? Is there a policy? And one of the things that I found in my particular course is that I was being super harsh, and not from a mean-spirited place, but they're going into social work. They need to understand rules and guidelines and deadlines. And so there's no extra credit. There's no homework. There's no, and I thought I was doing a good thing, right? But message sent was not message received. And what happened was I learned through the introspective process, or TEP, that I needed to build in more partnership language. So I still found a way to say no extra credit, right? No late assignments. And I began to shift it that if you need my support, reach out to me before the assignment is due, right? If you find yourself falling behind, connect with me. Let's get on Zoom. Let's have a call. Let's make sure that you understand things. Those are things that I would do for all of my students. But what happened was it was just a disconnect in how I was using my language, and it didn't speak partnership. But that is absolutely what my goal was to create.
You know, for a lot of state organizations, let's face it, that the cultural gravity often is towards bureaucracy, right? So we use language that's neutral, that's, you know, nobody's going to take offense by, but are we being human? Are we being accessible in a way that people feel like we're open to whatever they need to talk to us about? And that's where I think that a lot of the cultural shift is going on, right?
Right, and absolutely. And if we are here for students to succeed, we really are. And if that takes a few more emails, or if that takes a few more conversations, coming early to class, then a few minutes after, opening up my office hours, those are things that I would do for everybody, but they are extremely important to our students of color.
Well, and one of the things in that regard that Dr. Bolton's talked about, which I thought was both provocative but really interesting, is when he said, it's not enough that we have equal opportunity. We need to work toward equal outcomes. And a lot of instructors were like, you know, that was, okay, we're definitely for opportunity, but how can we be responsible for outcomes? Well, when you start looking at your class in a different way.
Right, and when you're designing, most of us have went through higher education, and we understand that there's a learning objective so that we understand what we're doing in the class, but we also understand that there's an outcome. So not many of us would have incurred all this student loan debt if they said, well, you're going to incur, but you're not going to graduate, and you're probably not going to succeed in my class, and you're probably, right? We all had those instructors that, you know, it's difficult to get an A in my class, right? Then tell me what is necessary for me to be able to get an A or to be successful in your classroom. And that's free, to make sure that we are clear in expectations, and that we're also responsible for outcomes.
I want to talk about structure for a moment, because I know a lot of colleges, when you find the chief diversity officer, they're often like under student services or under some other level. You report directly to the president. How is that important?
That is extremely important, because it sends a powerful message when we say, not only is our diversity or chief inclusion officer an important role to the college, but they're so important that we want them at the executive leadership table every week. And we want to make sure that we understand what's going on and that they're able to communicate in a manner that makes sense. And so I think it's important to be at the table. But I think something else that's more important is that knowing that there is an opportunity that I can speak to the direct person, Dr. Bowden, in contact, and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing, this is what I'm hearing. What do you think about this? How do we make sure A, B, and C is done? And so that's something he and I, for the most part, meet weekly. And we have those discussions, and we do want to know how communication is received and how we can do it better. And then we also bring those conversations into the executive boardroom as well. And then so we're kind of challenging and also speaking about opportunities individually, he and I, and then we open that up to the entire executive leadership team.
Well, the college student body is more diverse than any other college in our region, but that is not necessarily, well, it's not reflected in our faculty and staff. Is that a problem? And if so, what do we do about it?
It is a problem, right? So anytime that we are saying that there's a disparity in any number, whether that's faculty, so I'm just going to say instructional, non-instructional staff, we do want to make sure that our students are able to see representations of themselves in our campuses. But I would also say that we also want to make sure that our employees feel like they're a part of an organization that's representative of themselves. So it really is I want to say it's complicated, but when you start to think about diversifying the workforce, that's going to take a lot of attention, and that's going to be one of the primary goals. I don't want to give it up. Dr. Bolton and I, we're going to talk about the data and what that looks like from our students to our instructional and non-instructional staff. So we'll give you very specifics. But one of the things I would tell you about diversifying the workforce, I would love to see us not only have a task force that is responsible for looking at things like Hispanic serving institution, are there gaps between instruction and non-instructional staff and our students of color? But I think what's important is for it not to be on somebody's plate who has 14 other jobs per se. And I'm guilty of that. I'm guilty of, I've got all these other areas.
You say yes too often. That's your problem.
Right. And so what happens is I give you my best at that moment because I have other things that are pulling for my time and my attention. I would like to see us have a task force where they're not totally tapped out on other opportunities or jobs, et cetera. So I think that's going to be important.
You mentioned Hispanic serving institution. Now, one of the goals, one of the markers of a Hispanic serving institution is 25% Hispanic student population. And we have gone from, I believe it was 17% a few years ago, and now we're 23%. We're very close. How important is that we become the Hispanic serving institution, do you think?
I think it's important because it's the best thing that we can do for our community. I think it's important that we create as many avenues as possible for students of color, all students, but specifically for those demographics that have maybe been underrepresented. So that's important. When I checked last Friday, I think our numbers were at about 22.7%. And we are very confident that we are going to hit that target of becoming a Hispanic serving institution within the next year or so. It could be sooner, not quite sure with COVID and how that's going to impact us. But I think something that's equally important is that as we strive to become a Hispanic serving institution, we also have to have an equal commitment to making sure that we are hiring both instructional and non-instructional staff to serve the needs of our students, and especially the population that we've grown the most in.
One of the things, Tiko, that I've noticed is that you tend to use a lot of inclusive language when you talk about this work. And we've had a history of a lot of people working here in staff and instruction who've had their buttons pushed very easily in presentations about diversity and inclusion work. And particularly when we talk about anti-racism, when we talk about critical race theory, what's your approach to this? And do you think that is it important to lean into the more controversial areas and the ideas that will challenge us more? Or does that stop people from getting on the boat with us?
Okay, Warren, that's a fully loaded question there.
I know, but isn't this the biggest one and most important?
Well, here's what I think. I think we have a unique opportunity that we don't have to have this adversarial relationship around any of these different theoretical frameworks that we want to use to have a conversation. So I
I
think
disagree. I want to have a fight about. Sorry.
you know what? Some people do. And so here's what I like to tell people, like even with what you just said, I disagree. As I'm having these conversations, I always tell people, let's not disagree. Allow me to offer a different perspective, allow you to offer a different perspective, because if we agree to disagree, we don't actually bring closure to the issue. The second piece, there's a quote that I use all the time, and it says that conflict is inevitable, but combat is optional, right? So how we choose to engage in these conversations around race, I'm saying, yes, we're going to talk about the impact of racism in America on, individuals, people of color, but we're also going to talk about American history and Black history and, Hispanic American history. All of these things, we need to do it together. But I will tell you the biggest thing that I've been experiencing is that we spend a lot of time talking about having courageous conversations. But I think there is one opportunity that we have to include. After we have that courageous conversation, where do I ask the difficult questions? So where do I inquire more about race? Where do I inquire more about, so one of the examples, we were talking with some people and somebody that talked about pulling the race car, and sometimes people pull the race car. That is absolutely a question and a perspective that somebody can have. That's a difficult question. And so being able to sit with that uncomfortableness and allow a space for both the courageous conversation and a space to ask those difficult questions, I think that's how we move forward. There are some legitimate questions that staff, students, and faculty and instructors may have around critical race theory, around being an anti-racist organization. When we say that, what we're saying is that we understand the impact that racism has had, and we acknowledge that we're committed to combating racism in our organization. And I think if we come together on that premise, I think that's a great building place for us to start. And that if people have had these experiences that has shut them down, I would ask you, give us another opportunity. Let me take you out to coffee. Let's have a conversation. Your voice matters, and our college needs your perspective.
Perfect. When you talk about courageous conversations, I can't help but think about your predecessor, Keith Barnes, and I'd like us to give a shout out to Keith. Are there ways in which Keith made your job easier?
Absolutely, right? So whenever you are doing any job, Keith had the first position of this role, right? So you get to kind of try some stuff. This didn't work, that works. This works better. I get to kind of come in and say, oh, okay, we tried this, but how do we enhance some of the work that he was doing? And it's not even Keith. I would think if we really look, our society has shifted. When we saw George Floyd, who was murdered, I think it raised up something in most Americans that said, this is not acceptable. And what are we going to need to do to take action as a whole? And so I think that also made my job, I don't want to say easier because it's not easier, but it also made people, in my opinion, a little bit more open to having these conversations of injustice. And so I think Keith did a wonderful job, but even just as a society, we're shifting from awareness, here's what's going on, here's how you identify. And now I think most of us are saying, but what are the action steps? How do we now solidify change and change our organizations to move forward to make sure that we're doing the best, not only for our workforce and our staff, but also for our students. And so I think him laying the foundation, getting things going was very meaningful for me. And then I think society also primed me to be able to enhance our conversation.
The other thing that Keith did was, well, first of all, let's talk about the courageous conversations. He had multiple events going on. Obviously, during COVID, it's been a challenge, but we did a lot of things on Zoom. What do you have planned in the way of events, and do you see that as an important part of your role?
So I absolutely see it as an important part of the office's role. So I keep wanting to say, hey, we have this office.
It just not be me. Right.
Even though the office is me right now. But think about our stakeholders. So we have faculty, we have staff, non-instructional and instructional staff, we have students, all in our community. These are all stakeholders. So what happens is right now, what I need to, and I'm hoping to prioritize, is how do we build an infrastructure where you can actually hand this group per se off and to, you know, somebody that's student focused, somebody that's staff focused, and then somebody that's instructional focused, and then even community. So we're not going to be able to start there with one person right away. So what I'm hoping to do is to build a pathway that eventually we can make sure that we're serving all of our stakeholders in a way that's meaningful for them. One of the things that I started with is, many of you have heard about the affinity groups, where we're going to have groups of people who are either been a part of diversity initiatives or who want to be a part. And we're going to have groups that are kind of separated by stakeholder. And it's not that we want to separate what we're going to do, because the role is for the office to bring all of these stakeholders together. Right. But what we want to do is, if you're passionate about staff development around equity issues, we want to make sure we leverage that for you. If you're passionate about instruction, or if you're passionate about being a part of leadership and leading teams. And so that's one way in which we're trying to create an avenue, which makes it easier for me, right? Because I can show up at all of these different groups, but to have to lead them all and to have to do some of these things isn't as workable right now, but we're going to get there. So everybody is equally important. I just, coming out of the classroom, kind of have a few connections that I'm trying to leverage as faculty. So that's where I'm starting, but it absolutely is not where I'm stopping.
Well, you know, to piggyback on that, how does having been in the classroom give you insights into the work we need to do? How does that help?
I think being in the classroom is one avenue. I think the most powerful insight that I have is being a community college student who was a single parent, who came from generational poverty and faced a lot of the barriers that some of our students face. So I think that lens is extremely important to have. The second lens that I think is extremely beneficial for me is being a social worker. How do we treat everybody with respect and dignity? And how do we bring everybody together, regardless of affiliation? And then you add the faculty piece to that. And I think it's the well-roundedness of all of those things together, being a student, being a social worker, and also being in the classroom. It's all of those that I think gives me, I don't want to say an advantage, but it gives me insight that I'm super excited and privileged to have.
One of the things that included everybody in the college was the opportunity to recognize the great work in diversity and equity and inclusion that our peers were doing. Are you going to continue to give those awards, and should we be thinking about those nominations?
Absolutely. And I think Karen is trying to get in, so absolutely.
Yeah, I would love to. Karen, do we have any interesting comments or questions there?
Tiko, you mentioned some of those working groups or affinity groups, and we had a question about how do you join those groups?
So I'm glad you asked. So what's going to happen is, I'm going to send you a link. You will get a link to sign up. We're going to have 3 different groups. I'm going to offer one group in the morning, one in the afternoon, and one in the evening. So, right, that we can make sure whatever your schedule is, you can be a part of that. And we're going to do those at the end of the month. We are going to have one on Wednesday the 28th, Thursday the 30th, and Friday the 24th. And I will send all of this out. So be on the lookout for an email from Equity and Inclusion. And it's going to have a link for you to sign up on what day works best for you. And
Yeah,
so
let's get
that's
those
where
all on the college calendars. Excellent.
and that's where we're going to talk about. So what does all this mean? What are we going to do? What is the goal? What are the goals of these particular groups? And you can also revisit the email that I sent out, that introduction email, and asking and inviting you to be a part of the team.
Great.
More questions, Karen?
Yeah, so is the PPCC Instructional Services Equity Plan still going to be implemented with respect to annual goals?
I'm sorry, what was that last piece?
And if you could turn up your volume a little bit, Karen, there.
Is the PPCC Instructional Services Equity Plan still going to be implemented with respect to annual goals?
So I am not aware of the equity plan being related to the evaluation goals. So that would be something you might want to talk with the dean more. I can ask more about that and get back with you as far as that particular piece. But the content of the equity plan is actually absolutely going to be a part of what we do moving forward. And I feel like that document is super important because there were a lot of voices represented. I know Deidre was a part of that. Jackie was a part of that. We had a really diverse group of voices. And so I think that action plan, there's really good components that we can use from that. But as far as the evaluation piece, I don't have any knowledge at this particular time about that part.
And we should, when we talk about strategic goals, we should mention that we're going to be undergoing a new, the last strategic plan went through to this year, and we'll be working this fall on a new strategic plan that will be for the next 5 years. And obviously, equity and inclusion will be a large part of that.
And I will tell you, as a faculty member, I still teach in the classroom right now. I will absolutely be advocating for us to make sure that we have every resource possible to make sure that our college individuals can be successful, especially if we were to have a conversation about evaluations. I would hope, and I know that I feel like we want to have a lot of conversations around that.
Karen, any other thoughts or nice comments that you want to share from the
kudos about the work that you're doing?
Kudos the work that you're doing. Absolutely. I think there was something about your beautiful face, but
you guys are so sweet. And like, I feel like we're doing amazing work. And while we have opportunities and challenges, we also have people that are super excited about helping our organization shift into that equity mindset. And so I think that I'm fortunate, and I'm not just saying this, to work with a lot of people who want us to go to the next level, who want to make sure that we have a desirable work environment, and that our students feel like they belong every time they come through our doors in every classroom that they're sitting in. So I think you guys are the true unsung heroes, per se.
Well, I want to thank you, Tiko. I really appreciate it. I want to thank all our students out there who've joined us, our faculty and staff. Karen, thanks for passing along. Any other final comments that you had to pass along?
No.
No. And Haley, I want to thank you for doing interpretation. And we will be doing this. Our plan is that we're going to be doing, just as we have done previously, we're going to be doing these Facebook Live interviews 2 o'clock every Tuesday for the rest of my life. So if there's, and please, if anybody has any questions related to areas that they would like to see a Facebook Live about, please just leave that in the chat for this live event. The other thing is we will be sending out a link to this event for those who missed it. And I know, there's a lot of people who aren't on Facebook for whatever reason. We respect that. We do know it's a good way to reach a whole lot of you. So what we're going to do is we're going to do it on Facebook, but then we're going to put it on the website, send out links that you can still experience what we had. And we hopefully will never have like essential information that you will need to survive till the next day if you miss it. So I want to thank everybody for being involved. And you have one last thing to say, Tiko?
Yeah, one last thing I was going to say. Also, be on the lookout. Dr. Bolton and I are going to have a town hall. And in that town hall, we're actually going to talk about the data. We're going to talk about disaggregate data from race, ethnicity, our students to staff, instructional, non-instructional by race. What does that look like? So I want you guys to know we are, and I think we've done a fairly good job, but we're going to remain transparent. We are going to tell you where we are, and we're absolutely going to answer your questions for where we're going to go and how we get there. So please join that town hall that he and I will also have Patricia Diawara on there to talk a little bit about the institutional data and what has changed over the years. I think you might find that extremely informative. So.
Well, and people should know that looking deeply at those data sets really tells us where do we need to put our attention and where don't we need to put our attention. So I really appreciate it. And the work that Patricia and her team do keeps us on track and keeps us focused so much of the time. So I'm glad she's going to be joining us, and as well as Dr. Bolton on that. And we'll give you all the details about that town hall coming up. Thank you all, and we'll be sending out the links shortly.
Thanks, everybody. See you soon.